Right now, somewhere in your kitchen, there is more food than an entire Ice Age village would see in a year. You don't think about it. You open the fridge. You close it. You decide nothing in there looks good enough. But the real answer to what happens when food disappears is far stranger than hunger. For most of human history, winter wasn't a season. It was a countdown. There was no fridge, no grain silo guaranteed to last, no grocery store glowing at midnight. There was only what you had stored, what you had hunted, and the number of days left until the thaw. So, what did your ancestors actually do when that number hit zero? Anthropologists who study hunter gatherer and early agricultural societies have spent decades reconstructing the answer, and it isn't a simple story of starvation, it's a story of strategy. Your body, long before your mind understood why, was already preparing. Around 12,000 years ago, in places like the Near East and parts of Europe, early humans began noticing something. Some years the cold months were survivable, other years they weren't. The difference wasn't luck, it was preparation that started in late summer. Researcher Brian Hayden, who studied feasting and food storage in pre-agricultural societies, found that communities didn't wait for winter to think about winter. They thought about it constantly, all year, through a kind of obsessive forward planning that modern humans rarely practice anymore. Drying meat, smoking fish, burying root vegetables in cool pits lined with bark, fermenting anything that would otherwise rot, because fermentation, strangely, was one of the earliest forms of food insurance. Every one of these methods bought time. Time was the only currency that mattered, but preparation wasn't always enough. Some winters lasted longer than expected. Some stores were raided by animals or by rival groups or simply ran out 2 weeks too early. When that happened, the response wasn't chaos, it was a sequence. First, the group reduced movement. Less activity meant fewer calories burned, and bodies that had evolved through repeated famine cycles were remarkably good at slowing their own metabolism in response to scarcity. This is the part that should unsettle you a little. Your body still knows how to do this. Researcher Ansel Keys, in a famous mid-20th century study now known as the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, found that when caloric intake dropped sharply, participants' metabolism slowed, their thoughts narrowed almost entirely to food, and their personalities shifted toward irritability and obsession. That wasn't a flaw in the participants. That was a survival circuit, the same one your ancient ancestors relied on every single winter, switching on exactly the way it was designed to. Second, after movement was reduced, the group rationed. Not equally in most cases. Children and those still capable of contributing physically often received priority, an uncomfortable but biologically logical hierarchy that shows up across nearly every documented subsistence culture under stress. Third, if rationing failed, groups did something that modern people rarely imagine. They split apart. Smaller groups required less food to sustain. A family of 6 could survive on supplies that wouldn't stretch for a band of 30. So when winter turned brutal, communities sometimes fractured temporarily, scattering into smaller units, each hoping to reconvene once spring made food abundant again. This single behavior may be one of the oldest forms of human social contract. Stay together when there's enough. Spread apart when there isn't. Reunite when the danger passes. It wasn't cruelty. It was math, written in flesh and breath instead of numbers. And when even that failed, when the ground stayed frozen and the stores stayed empty, ancient humans turned to something almost nobody talks about: insects, bark, and anything technically edible that modern people would never touch. Archaeological evidence from multiple Ice Age sites shows traces of consumed lichen, inner tree bark ground into a kind of flour, and small insects processed in large quantities, not delicacies, desperation foods, but foods that, calorie for calorie, kept people alive long enough to see the first green shoots of spring. Here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. This entire system, the planning, the rationing, the splitting apart, the eating of bark when nothing else remained, did something more than keep bodies alive. It shaped how your brain processes scarcity today. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman, in research on loss aversion conducted decades later, found that human beings feel the pain of losing something roughly twice as intensely as they feel the pleasure of gaining the equivalent. That asymmetry isn't random. It's the fingerprint of thousands of generations where losing your food store wasn't an inconvenience. It was potentially the difference between a hard winter and a fatal one. You inherited that fingerprint. You feel it when your bank account drops faster than it should. You feel it when you open the fridge and it's emptier than you expected, even though you live in an age with more available calories per person than at any point in human history. You feel it, oddly, when you're simply bored and restless during a long stretch of gray weather, an echo of a body that once associated winter with reduced activity for a reason. None of that anxiety is irrational. It's ancient. It's just misfiring slightly in a world that no longer matches the one it was built for. Modern winters don't threaten your food supply. Supply chains, refrigeration, and global agriculture have made that kind of scarcity, for most people reading this, a non-issue. But the circuitry built across thousands of winters of real scarcity didn't get an update. So you still stock up before storms, you still feel a strange comfort buying extra groceries when the temperature drops, even when you know logically that nothing will run out. You still feel a tightening in your chest watching your pantry shelves thin out, even surrounded by more food security than 99% of humans who ever lived. That tightening isn't weakness, it's memory, just not memory you consciously formed. Memory written into the architecture of your stress response by every ancestor who made it through a hard winter and passed that wiring forward. Right now, somewhere in your kitchen, there is more food than an entire Ice Age village would see in a year. And somewhere in your nervous system, a body built across 100,000 winters still hasn't quite believed that.